Mandalay fell in 3 days, and it took less than 3 years after that for the British to have the last king of Burma gone from his own soil completely. Thibaw Min, the final sovereign of the Konbaung dynasty, had ruled for 7 years when a British column reached the edges of his capital in November 1885, sent by a colonial administration in London that wanted Upper Burma's teak forests and river trade, and had grown impatient with a monarchy it considered unstable, indebted to French interests, and inconvenient to the men who ran the Bombay Burmah Trading Corporation. Within days, the king who had once presided over a court of white umbrellas and gilded spires was on a bullock cart, then a river steamer, then a ship bound for Madras, and from there to a small coastal town called Ratnagiri, where he would spend the next 31 years waiting for a homecoming that never arrived. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. His queen, Supayalat, a woman whose reputation for ruthlessness outlived nearly every other fact people remembered about her reign, went into exile beside him. What happened to their kingdom afterward, to their palace, their daughters, and eventually their bodies, is not a story of a monarchy that simply faded from memory. It is a story of what a colonial government does with royalty it cannot kill and will not let go home, and what a people do, a century later, with the memory of a throne that has not stood in their own capital in living memory. Thibaw had never expected to be king. He was the son of King Mindon, one of the more capable rulers Burma produced in the 19th century, a monarch who tried to modernize his kingdom's administration, currency, and army, while keeping the British East India Company and its successors at arm's length. Mindon had rebuilt Mandalay itself as a new royal capital in the 1850s, laying it out according to old Buddhist cosmological principles, with the palace at its center as a kind of terrestrial mirror of Mount Meru, the axis of the universe in Burmese Buddhist cosmology. He had dozens of children by numerous wives, and Thibaw, born in 1859, was a minor prince who spent part of his youth studying in a Buddhist monastery, where he was remembered as quiet, studious, and largely uninterested in the court intrigue that surrounded his father's enormous family. Palace records describe him as a capable student of Pali scripture, a young man more comfortable with religious texts than with the maneuvering of ministers and queens. Nothing in his early life suggested a throne was coming for him. When Mindon died in 1878 without clearly naming a successor, the palace erupted into exactly the kind of succession crisis that had destroyed weaker dynasties before it. Thibaw's principal wife, Supayalat, and her mother, the Dowager Queen Shinbumashin, orchestrated his rise to the throne, and in the process arranged one of the darkest episodes in Konbaung history. To eliminate any rival claim, dozens of Thibaw's half-brothers, half-sisters, and their young children were rounded up over several nights in February 1879 and executed inside the palace grounds, their bodies reportedly trampled by elephants to avoid the spilling of royal blood by human hands, a detail that appears in multiple contemporary British and Burmese accounts of the massacre. Thibaw was 20 years old. Whether he ordered the killings himself or simply failed to stop them has never been fully settled, but the massacre attached itself to his name for the rest of his life and gave British newspapers, already looking for a pretext, exactly the kind of lurid material they needed to paint the Burmese court as barbaric and its king as unfit to rule. The story traveled well beyond Burma. It was retold in London drawing rooms and in the Rangoon press controlled by British and Anglo-Burmese interests, and it did more damage to the reputation of the Konbaung court than any single military defeat could have. The Konbaung dynasty into which Thibaw had been born was, by the standards of Southeast Asian monarchies, a relatively young one, founded in 1752 by a village headman named Alaungpaya, who united the Burmese kingdoms after a period of civil war and went on to build an empire that, at its height under later kings, extended its influence into Siam, Manipur, and Assam. Konbaung kings had fought wars with Siam over the old capital of Ayutthaya, clashed repeatedly with the expanding British presence in Bengal, and by the early 19th century found themselves facing a colonial power whose military and industrial capacity had begun to outstrip anything a Southeast Asian kingdom could muster on its own. The first two Anglo-Burmese wars, in 1824 and 1852, had already stripped away Arakan, Tenasserim, and eventually the whole of Lower Burma, including the port city of Rangoon, leaving the Konbaung court increasingly cut off from the sea and from the customs revenue that maritime trade had once provided. By the time Thibaw inherited the throne in 1878, the kingdom he ruled was a fraction of what his grandfather's generation had governed, its army modernized only in patches, its treasury dependent on internal trade routes rather than the ports the British now controlled. For the next 6 years, Thibaw governed a kingdom that was shrinking in every direction that mattered. Lower Burma had already been annexed by the British decades earlier, after two previous wars, in 1826 and 1852, so what remained of the Konbaung kingdom by the 1880s was Upper Burma, centered on Mandalay, a landlocked remnant of a once larger realm that had, under earlier kings, stretched into parts of modern Thailand, Assam, and Manipur. Thibaw's government, pressed for revenue and wary of British economic domination, began negotiating more closely with France, discussing a possible treaty that would have given French interests a stake in Burmese railways and mining concessions, and possibly a French bank to issue currency independent of British India's financial system. It was this, more than any single act of cruelty attributed to the king, that alarmed the India Office and the merchants of Rangoon. A French foothold in Upper Burma threatened to open a back door into British India itself at a moment when Britain and France were competing for influence across Southeast Asia, and colonial officials began looking for a justification to finish what the two earlier wars had left undone. They found one in a trade dispute with the Bombay Burmah Trading Corporation, a British timber firm that Thibaw's government had fined for underreporting the teak it extracted from royal forests, teak that was among the most valuable timber in the world at the time, prized for shipbuilding and construction across the British Empire. The fine was, by most accounts, entirely within the king's legal authority to impose, a routine matter of forestry taxation. The British government treated it as an act of aggression against a British commercial enterprise, and the language of the resulting diplomatic correspondence grew steadily more threatening through the autumn of 1885. On the 22nd of November 1885, an ultimatum was delivered to the Burmese court, demanding that the kingdom submit to British control over its foreign relations and accept a resident political officer in Mandalay, terms that would have effectively ended Burmese sovereignty without a shot being fired. Thibaw's ministers debated for days inside the palace's audience halls. Some urged submission, understanding what British artillery and modern rifles could do to a Burmese army that was, by 1885, poorly equipped and unevenly trained, still relying in places on antiquated matchlocks and outdated cannon. Others urged resistance on the grounds that surrender without a fight would be a greater disgrace than defeat, that a kingdom which had unified so much of mainland Southeast Asia under earlier kings owed its ancestors at least the appearance of resistance. In the end, the ultimatum expired without an answer that satisfied London, and a British expeditionary force under General Harry Prendergast advanced up the Irrawaddy River toward Mandalay, accompanied by a flotilla of armed steamers that dwarfed anything the Burmese river defenses could muster. The Third Anglo-Burmese War, as it would later be called, was less a war than an occupation. Burmese resistance along the river was scattered and quickly overwhelmed. Mandalay itself surrendered without a prolonged siege. On the 28th of November, less than a week after the ultimatum had been issued, British troops entered the palace compound. Thibaw and Supayalat were found inside the throne room, seated beneath the golden spire that marked the ceremonial center of the entire kingdom, where they had apparently chosen to wait rather than flee into the countryside as some of their advisors had urged. Photographs taken in the days that followed show the royal couple seated on the floor of a British steamer, stripped of the ceremonial trappings that had surrounded them days earlier, already being processed as prisoners rather than treated as a deposed head of state and his consort. The speed of the collapse stunned observers on both sides. A kingdom that had existed in some form for centuries, and in its Konbaung incarnation since the middle of the 18th century, had been brought to its knees in under a week of organized military movement. What happened to the physical inheritance of the kingdom in the weeks that followed tells you almost everything about how thoroughly the annexation was designed to erase, not merely defeat, the Konbaung monarchy. British officers and soldiers looted the palace treasury within days of the occupation, carrying off gold ornaments, ceremonial weapons, manuscripts bound in lacquer, and religious objects that had been accumulated by generations of Konbaung kings as offerings to Buddhist monasteries and as symbols of royal legitimacy. The most valuable single object taken was the Na Mauk ruby, an enormous uncut stone considered one of the great regalia of the Burmese crown, which vanished from official custody almost immediately and was never definitively accounted for again, its fate the subject of speculation for more than a century afterward, with rumors ranging from a private British collection to a royal vault in London that has never been confirmed. The Lion Throne, the ceremonial seat from which Burmese kings had ruled for generations, one of 8 thrones that had originally stood in different halls of the palace representing different aspects of royal authority, was crated and shipped first to Calcutta and eventually displayed in a colonial museum, separated from the country and the dynasty it had symbolized. Court records, some of the only detailed administrative history of the late Konbaung period, were scattered across British archives in India and Burma, many never fully catalogued, leaving historians today with an incomplete and fragmented picture of how the kingdom had actually functioned in its final years. On the 1st of January 1886, without any formal treaty of cession and without any consultation of the Burmese population, the British government simply proclaimed the annexation of Upper Burma to the Crown, folding what remained of an independent Burmese state into British India as though it were an administrative afterthought. There was no monarchy left to negotiate its own end. There was only a proclamation, read out to a population that had not been asked whether it accepted the terms. Thibaw and Supayalat were taken first to Madras, then, after brief consideration of other locations, settled permanently in Ratnagiri, a modest coastal town roughly midway between Bombay and Goa, chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with the couple's comfort or dignity and everything to do with distance. Ratnagiri was far enough from Burma that any attempt to smuggle the exiled king back toward his former kingdom, or to use him as a rallying point for nationalist unrest among a Burmese population still adjusting to colonial rule, would be logistically difficult. It was close enough to Bombay that British colonial administrators could monitor the household without excessive difficulty, and telegraph communication with the provincial government remained reliable. The government allotted the family a modest bungalow, initially cramped and unsuited to a family that had once occupied a palace of more than 100 buildings, and a pension that colonial records describe as adequate but far below what would have sustained a royal court, a fraction of the wealth the family had commanded only months earlier. Supayalat, who had once ruled alongside her husband with a political ruthlessness that terrified rivals inside the Mandalay court, spent the opening years of the exile in a state that visitors and British officials alike described as bitter, restless, and prone to conflict with the small staff of guards and administrators assigned to the household, several of whom she accused of petty theft and disrespect. Thibaw, by contrast, appears in most surviving accounts as withdrawn, spending long hours reading, gardening, and practicing the Buddhist devotions that had shaped his early years in the monastery, a quiet contrast to the queen whose reputation had once eclipsed his own. Local residents of Ratnagiri, largely unfamiliar with Burmese royalty, gradually grew accustomed to the presence of the exiled king, and over the decades a small but genuine curiosity developed among the townspeople about the family living behind the walls of what came to be known locally as the King's House. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. 4 daughters were born to the couple, 2 before the annexation and 2 after it, and all 4 grew up almost entirely within the confines of the Ratnagiri household, a strange, isolated upbringing for princesses whose birthright had included a palace of more than 100 buildings and a court of thousands of attendants, ministers, and monks. The family's finances deteriorated steadily across the decades of exile. Petitions to the colonial government for an increased pension were repeatedly denied or granted only in part, and by the early years of the 20th century, contemporary correspondence describes a household that was, by any standard befitting a former royal family, genuinely poor, at times unable to maintain the modest bungalow in good repair or to properly provide for visiting relatives from Burma. Thibaw's own health declined through his 40s and 50s, worsened by the years of confinement and by a diet and climate that never suited a man raised in the cooler hill country around Mandalay. British medical officers who examined him in his final years noted chronic illness that they attributed, in the clinical language of the period, to a body worn down by prolonged psychological strain as much as by any single disease, a diagnosis that, whatever its scientific limitations, captured something real about 3 decades spent watching a kingdom recede further into the past with each passing year. He had waited 7 years for a house to be built for him in Ratnagiri that finally matched, in some small measure, the dignity he had once taken for granted, a modest but proper residence, with rooms arranged in a way that echoed, however faintly, the arrangement of the palace he had lost, and he lived in it for almost exactly as long as he had reigned before dying inside it, on the 16th of December 1916, at the age of 57. What happened to his body afterward is, in its own way, as revealing as anything that happened while he was alive. Supayalat, petitioned the colonial government for a Buddhist funeral befitting a king, and for permission to send his remains home to be interred among his ancestors at Mandalay, a request rooted in Burmese Buddhist belief about the proper treatment of the dead and the spiritual consequences of a king buried far from his own soil. Both requests were refused. British officials feared that returning the body of the last Burmese monarch to Burmese soil, even in death, might reignite exactly the nationalist sentiment the annexation had been designed to prevent, particularly at a moment when anti-colonial movements were gathering strength across British India and, more quietly, across Burma itself. Thibaw was buried in a modest grave beside a Christian cemetery in Ratnagiri, a resting place chosen not for religious or dynastic reasons, but for simple administrative convenience, a final small humiliation appended to 31 years of larger ones. No Buddhist monks were permitted to conduct the full royal funerary rites that Konbaung tradition demanded for a reigning monarch, and the ceremony that did take place was scaled down to something colonial officials considered appropriately modest for a deposed foreign prince rather than a king. His grave remained there, visited by almost no one from his own country, for nearly a century, marked only by a simple stone that gave little indication of who lay beneath it or what he had once ruled. Supayalat and her surviving daughters were finally permitted to leave Ratnagiri in 1919, 3 years after Thibaw's death, once the First World War had ended, and colonial administrators judged that enough time had passed for the family to no longer pose any political risk to British authority in Burma. They were not sent to Mandalay, the city where the family had once reigned, but to Rangoon, the colonial capital that had grown up around the very administration that ended their kingdom, a city built largely by British and Indian commercial interests rather than the older Burmese royal centers of the interior. Supayalat, by then an elderly woman well into her 50s, spent her final years there as something between a curiosity and a living relic, visited daily by Burmese well-wishers who came to sit before her as though the throne room had simply relocated to a private house on a Rangoon street, bringing small gifts and asking for her blessing in a way that suggested the old reverence for Konbaung royalty had never fully disappeared, only gone underground for 3 decades. Something of her old sharpness returned to her in those years, according to visitors who described her regaining a measure of the humor and force of personality that had once dominated the Mandalay court, even as her body weakened with age. She died in 1925, and in a final irony that no one present at the surrender in 1885 could have predicted, the same colonial government that had denied her husband a royal funeral gave her a state funeral, complete with a procession through the streets of Rangoon, and she was buried in Rangoon not far from the pagoda where her husband's first wife already lay, a small but unmistakable acknowledgement, 6 decades after the annexation began, of the family's enduring significance to the Burmese public, even under colonial rule. The eldest daughter, Myat Phaya, never fully settled into the life the family found after 1919. Her relationship with Gopal, a household servant she had loved since her years in Ratnagiri, kept pulling her back toward the town where she had spent her childhood in exile, and she moved between Rangoon and Ratnagiri for years afterward, according to some accounts eventually returning to India permanently while her sisters remained in Burma, a choice that scandalized parts of Burmese society at the time, given the difference in status between a Konbaung princess and the man she loved, but one that she appears to have made without regret. The second daughter, Myat Phaya, became the senior surviving member of the royal house after her father's death, and held that position, largely ceremonial and entirely without political power, for the next 4 decades, serving as a point of contact for Burmese who still wished to pay respects to the old royal line, even as the country moved through independence from Britain in 1948 and into the turbulence of its early post-colonial decades. She died in Kalimpong in the Indian state of West Bengal in April 1956, having spent much of her later life away from the country her father once ruled. The youngest, Myat Phaya, lived out her adult life in Moulmein, with her husband and 6 children, choosing a quieter existence removed from the ceremonial burdens her elder sisters carried, and died there in March 1936, at the age of 48. Her descendants remained in Burma, and it is through her line that the family's connection to the country its ancestors once ruled has continued most directly into the present day, with grandchildren and great-grandchildren who grew up as ordinary citizens of independent Burma, while quietly carrying the memory of what their family had once been. The material inheritance of the Konbaung dynasty scattered even further than the family itself did. The crown lands and treasury holdings that had funded the kingdom's court, its temples, and its administration were absorbed directly into the colonial state at the moment of annexation, with no compensation offered to the family that had, until January of 1886, been recognized as the rightful owners of that wealth. The palace complex at Mandalay continued to serve British and later Burmese military purposes for decades, its throne room converted into an officer's mess where colonial soldiers dined beneath the same golden spire that had once marked the ceremonial center of an independent kingdom, and its outer buildings repurposed as garrison housing for soldiers who had no particular reason to think about what the buildings had once been for. During the Second World War, most of the original wooden palace structure that had survived the 1885 occupation was destroyed in fighting between Japanese and Allied forces as the war swept back through Burma in 1945, leaving only the moat, the outer walls, and a handful of later reconstructions standing on the site today. What a visitor sees walking through the palace grounds in Mandalay now is largely a 20th century recreation, built on the footprint of a building that was looted, occupied, and finally burned within the span of a single lifetime, a reconstruction that gestures toward the past without being able to fully restore it. The annexation did not only remove the king, it dismantled the entire administrative and social structure that had surrounded the throne. The Hludaw, the royal council of ministers that had governed the kingdom's day-to-day affairs for generations, was abolished within months, its members either absorbed into a new colonial bureaucracy, staffed increasingly by British and Indian officials, or left without any official function at all. The Mayo Thuggees, the hereditary township officials who had collected taxes and administered justice on the crown's behalf across Upper Burma, gradually lost their authority to a new system of appointed colonial administrators, severing a chain of local governance that in some families had lasted for generations. Buddhist monasteries, which had depended on royal patronage and royal land grants for centuries, lost their most important source of support and protection, a change that rippled through Burmese religious life long after the political question of the monarchy had been settled. Members of the wider Konbaung nobility, princes and princesses of lesser rank who had once held ceremonial positions and modest estates within the kingdom's hierarchy, found themselves scattered and stripped of status almost overnight, some fleeing to Siam or into remote parts of Upper Burma to avoid the same fate that had befallen Thibaw's own family, others quietly absorbed into ordinary colonial society under names that no longer carried any official recognition. It was, in the space of a single dry season, the dismantling of an entire world of rank and obligation that had structured Burmese life for a century and a half. For most of the 20th century, the government of independent Burma and later the military government of Myanmar kept a careful distance from the memory of the Konbaung monarchy, wary of a symbol that predated the modern state and carried its own competing claim to legitimacy at a moment when the ruling generals wanted no rivals to their own authority, however symbolic or historical those rivals might be. Textbooks mentioned Thibaw briefly, usually in connection with the palace massacre and the humiliation of the annexation, a convenient shorthand for colonial injustice that required no engagement with who the man actually was or what became of his family after 1885. That official distance began to close only in the 21st century, and slowly, as the political climate in Myanmar shifted and a new generation of officials began to see value in reconnecting the country to its pre-colonial royal history, rather than treating it as an embarrassment. In December 2012, U Thein Sein, then president of Myanmar, and the country's first nominally civilian leader after decades of military rule, traveled to Ratnagiri and visited Thibaw's grave, becoming the first head of state from his own country ever to do so, a visit that carried enormous symbolic weight for a nation only beginning to emerge from decades of isolation. He met with several of the king's living descendants during the trip, among them Queen Supayalat, a granddaughter of Thibaw through his fourth daughter, who by the time of that visit had spent her entire life carrying the family's history forward from Yangon and from Piano Luin in the Mandalay region, the closest living link between the court that fell in 1885 and the country that was only beginning, more than a century later, to reckon with what it had lost. 4 years afterward, in 2016, Myanmar's vice president and its military chief marked the 100th anniversary of Thibaw's death with a formal state acknowledgement, a gesture that would have been unthinkable within living memory of the men who had denied him a Buddhist burial a century earlier, and one that reflected a genuine, if belated, willingness to honor the last king as a historical figure rather than a colonial punchline. The house in Ratnagiri where the family lived out 3 decades of confinement still stands today, and Indian and Myanmar heritage officials have discussed for years, without fully resolving, how or whether to restore it as a museum that could formally connect the two countries to a shared and uncomfortable chapter of their history, one in which India served, however unwillingly on the part of the exiled family, as the site of a foreign monarchy's final years. Thibaw's remains have never been moved. He still lies in that small grave beside the Christian cemetery, on a stretch of Indian coastline his descendants visit but do not control. A king who ruled for 7 years and spent 31 more waiting for a homecoming that never came for him personally, even after it came, eventually, for almost everyone else in his family. The crown lands were never returned. The scattered regalia, including the Na Mauk ruby, were never fully accounted for, and remain today one of the more persistent unsolved questions of colonial-era plunder in Southeast Asia. And the palace that stands in Mandalay today, rebuilt from photographs and memory rather than preserved as it once was, is less a monument to what the Konbaung dynasty built than to what was taken from it in the span of 6 weeks in 1885, and never given back in any form that mattered. What remains of that kingdom now exists mostly in fragments deliberately kept apart. A ruby somewhere in a private collection or a museum vault whose provenance is never fully disclosed. A throne behind glass in a country that is not the one it was built to rule from. A grave beside a foreign cemetery, tended by strangers to the family for most of a century, now occasionally visited by presidents and descendants who arrived to stand in a place that colonial administrators chose for its convenience rather than its meaning. 4 daughters scattered between 2 countries, one buried in West Bengal, one in Moulmein, one somewhere between Rangoon and Ratnagiri, their descendants carrying a name that no longer opens any door except the door of memory. A dynasty does not always end with an execution or a dramatic last stand. Sometimes it ends the way this one did, in installments, across 3 decades and 2 countries, in pension disputes and denied funeral requests, and a museum project that has been discussed for years without being finished. The kingdom fell in 6 weeks. Making sure it stayed fallen took the rest of a family's life, and the reckoning with what that cost is still, more than 100 years later, unfinished business between 2 nations that have not yet decided how to fully tell this story together. What Thibaw and Supayalat lost in November of 1885 was never only a throne. It was a kingdom's ability to narrate its own end, and that loss, more than the ruby or the throne or the palace itself, is the one that has never been recovered. Visitors to Ratnagiri today can still walk the short distance from the old bungalow to the small grave by the cemetery wall, past a fishing town that has grown up around the family without ever fully absorbing their story into its own, a coastline that holds the last physical trace of a kingdom whose capital lies 1,100 miles away across the Bay of Bengal, in a country that has only just begun to ask what it owes to the memory of the man who is buried there. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.